Psalm 139, verse 14. Verse, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Explanation. Acknowledgement of God's intentional creation. Mark 12:31. Verse, love your neighbor as yourself. Explanation. A key principle of Christian ethics. Romans 5:8. Verse, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Explanation. Emphasizes unconditional love and grace. 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18 verse. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances. Explanation. Instructions for living a joyful, prayerful life. John 14:6. Verse, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Explanation. Jesus as the exclusive path to God.
All right, so today we're going to dive deep, really deep into some verses, some pretty powerful verses from the Bible.
Yeah, we've got a great mix, Psalms, Mark, Romans,
Thessalonians.
right, and John.
A real grab bag of some of the most, well, I guess you could say famous or well-known.
Yeah, and for good reason. They really touch on some of the core, human experiences.
Exactly.
Like creation.
Love, grace, faith, big stuff.
Big stuff, yeah.
So let's start with probably one of the most well-known verses, Psalm 139.13. Fearfully and wonderfully made. I mean, when you think about that, it's pretty profound, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it really makes you stop and think, about the miracle of life, the complexity of the human body.
Just how, intricate we are. And not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually.
Yeah, it's a real affirmation of our inherent worth.
Yeah.
This idea that we're not just accidents, we're created, with purpose.
Intentionally, yeah. And beautifully,
And beautifully, yeah.
And I think it's interesting because this verse, it kind of resonates with people from all different backgrounds, right?
It does, yeah.
Even people who may not subscribe to any particular religious belief, they can still appreciate that idea.
Absolutely. I think it's a universal truth, really. We are all, wonderful creations.
Yeah. So from creation to love, huh?
Yeah.
Mark 12.31.
Yeah.
This is another one that's it's really central to Christianity. It's love your neighbor as yourself. It sounds simple, right?
It does, but it's probably one of the hardest things to actually put into practice.
It is.
I mean, think about it. Who is our neighbor?
Right.
It's not just the person who lives next door.
Yeah, it's not just the person you like.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's everyone. It's the stranger on the street. It's the person who's different from you.
It's the person you disagree with.
Person you disagree with, yeah.
It's really challenging us to expand that definition of love and neighbor.
It is. It's about breaking down barriers,
It is. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone. And I think that's something that we're all kind of struggling with in a way.
Yeah, especially these days.
Especially these days, right? So, okay, let's move on to another very powerful verse. This one, it's often quoted, it's often debated. Romans 5:8, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now, this is one that I think really gets to the heart of grace.
It does. It's about unconditional love. This idea that we are loved even when we're not lovable.
Even when we mess up.
Even when we mess up, yeah.
Even when we make mistakes.
And that we're forgiven, that there's this possibility of redemption.
And that's, I mean, for some people, that's incredibly comforting.
It is, yeah. It can be really liberating.
Right. And for other people, it's like, wait, what?
Yeah. It raises questions.
Yeah.
About justice, about fairness.
Yeah, it definitely does. It's like, well, if I do something wrong, shouldn't there be consequences? And this verse is kind of saying, well, no, not necessarily. There's a different way. There's a way of grace. So yeah, it's definitely one that's I think it's worth really pondering.
It is. It really gets to the heart of, what it means to be human, I think.
Yeah, it does. And how we relate to a higher power, however we define that. So, okay, moving on to something a little more practical, maybe.
Okay.
1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. Now, this one has 3 parts. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances. That's a lot, right?
It is. It's a challenge for sure. But I think it's also really inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, how do you do that? Rejoice always, pray continually, Give thanks in all circumstances.
Right.
I mean, life is hard.
Life is hard, yeah.
But I think what this verse is trying to get at is this idea of cultivating a positive outlook.
Yeah, finding those moments of joy, even in the midst of difficulty.
Even when things are tough, there's still things to be grateful for.
There are, yeah. And I think prayer, it can be a way of connecting with something bigger than yourself, of finding strength and peace.
Yeah, it's that connection, right?
It is.
It's that feeling of not being alone.
And gratitude, it's been shown to have all sorts of benefits
Yeah.
for your mental and physical health.
It really changes your perspective.
It does, yeah. It helps you focus on the good. So even though it might seem like a really difficult task,
Yeah.
to rejoice always and give thanks in all circumstances,
Yeah.
it's worth striving for.
It is. It is. Okay, so we've got one more verse to dive into, and this one is, well, it's a big one.
It is
John 14.6. I am the way, the truth, and the life.
a very powerful statement.
Very powerful, yeah. And this is really at the core of Christian belief.
Mm.
This idea that Jesus is the only way to God.
Yeah. It's a statement of exclusivity,
It is.
which has, obviously been debated and discussed and interpreted in many different ways throughout history.
Yeah, because on the one hand, it's like, well, what about all the other religions?
Right.
What about all the other paths to truth or to enlightenment or to God, however you want to define it? And then on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, if you believe that Jesus is who he said he was, then this statement makes sense.
Yeah, it's a matter of faith, ultimately, and how you interpret that faith.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's definitely a challenging verse, but I think it's one that's worth wrestling with.
It is. It makes you think.
It does. So, we've covered a lot of ground here today,
We have.
from creation to love to grace to prayer to faith. What are some of your kind of key takeaways from these verses?
Well, I think what strikes me is how timeless they are, really.
Yeah.
They were written thousands of years ago, but they still speak to us today.
They do.
They address these fundamental questions that we all grapple with,
They do.
about who we are, why we're here, what's our purpose, how do we
Mhm.
live a good life, how do we treat each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes them so powerful.
It is. It is. So as we wrap up our deep dive today,
Yeah.
I'd like to leave you with a question to ponder.
Okay.
If you could sit down with the authors of these verses, the psalmists, the apostles, and you could ask them one question, what would it be? Just something to think about. And as you continue to explore these verses on your own, just remember that there's always more to discover, always more to learn. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.